pleasure to introduce my friend Margi Glavovic Nothard, who's visiting us from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, where she is the founding principal and design director of Glavovic Studio, which is an extraordinary firm. We've known each other for a long time, and in that time, I've had an opportunity to visit a number of the projects that Margi has built in South Florida firsthand. She is, and I find her practice extraordinary because of the range of different projects that she's been able to execute. These include the transformation of public space in things like the Hollywood Circle, the design and construction of very carefully thought through affordable housing projects that involve an extraordinary amount of community engagement to help realize these projects, and she'll show some of that as well. But in particular, I've always been an admirer of her cultural projects, work with, especially with small nonprofits early on, things like the Girls Project and, why am I blanking? Young at Art. And these are early projects that involve very finicky programs, very unforgiving sites, and very tiny budgets. And the work that she's able to do always has a sensitivity to the needs of different communities. And just there's a kind of a life in each of these projects that I've always really admired. So it's a real pleasure to welcome my friend Margi Nothard.
Thank you so much. Well, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing my work, and happy to answer questions and have a discussion afterwards. So I'm going to do like almost a catalogue of some of our projects from the last 20 years. And I thought this might be useful for the students to see how a certain point of view can be developed through architecture over time and start to see we have the benefit after 20 years of looking back. But I think this is important to let you know how you can imagine your future as well. I'm going to do that through the lens primarily of two types of projects. One is going to be affordable housing, and the other is through cultural projects. And I've selected that because I think that there's an alignment there. And I want to just remind us all of some of the most obvious things, like the fact that half of the US renters right now are considered rent burdened, which means that they can't afford their homes. They spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And more than 20 million US citizens, households, spend over half of their income on housing right now. And these numbers are hard to understand, and I'm hoping to go through some of the projects we're doing to help illustrate what it means to design in these kinds of environments. And we know that in the United States that housing finally has become a part of the conversation, and I'm grateful for that, because 20 years ago, no one really wanted to acknowledge that affordable housing was an issue. So as we all know, and we're in Florida, that our region is severely challenged by all these elements. You know, the juxtaposition of the environment with development. And this image has always been a perfect sort of, to me, metaphor in a way for our precarious relationship to the state that we all operate in and live in. So here's some of the projects. It's basically a series of built and unbuilt projects from this last 20 years. And I will be going into each of these in a little more detail. So my entire focus is try to think about housing for all of us. That's what I spend most of my days doing. My practice is around the country. I have a studio in Los Angeles and in Fort Lauderdale. We also have people in Argentina, South Africa, Portland, Fort Lauderdale. So we sort of try to manage our opportunities by expanding the people who can contribute to them. And I wanted to share this first project that was done. It was completed in 2012, so about 10 years ago. And why is that important? It allows us to look back a little bit on whether some of our assumptions and hypotheses actually have come true. And one of the things I'm proud to say is that I went to the police station and tried to get data, and yes, the crime has gone down, and this is an affordable housing project. We were just talking about it, one of your colleagues was there. It's located on a main artery east-west into downtown on Broward Boulevard, for those of you who know downtown. And it's about 132 units on about an 8-acre site. And it had 7 years of community battles. There was a lot of opposition to the project, mostly because it was affordable housing. There was also a tangential set of issues that had to do with the fact that there were existing small buildings on the site that the Housing Authority determined were not viable. So how do we go about making things affordable and still beautiful, right? How do we do this? So one of the elements we chose in this project was to look at prefabricated housing. Now, there's not a lot of that in Florida. We found this place up north near Ocala, and they did concrete prefabrication. So we designed the unit, the 1-bedroom unit, to be able to aggregate into a 2- and a 3-bedroom unit without expanding just essentially keeping the width the same. We based that on an existing building in the community of a 1924 house. Some of our goals also in this particular project were to really connect with the landscape, to celebrate living in South Florida and for everyone. And we also advocated for a kind of healthy living environment. We could have done 230 units, but the Housing Authority decided to stick with a lower density project because there's a historic district on the south. It reminds me of some of the conversations we just had in our review and how to transition. One of the things I try very hard on is to understand who our client is. Our client is not our client paying the bills. Our client is the person who's going to live there, spend their lives there, or potentially learn and grow from that place. A lot of seniors, single families, a lot of different folks. I try very hard in all these projects to think about how their life can be improved by the experience. In this project, for example, everyone had a balcony. And that just was an important metric. You know, it's a simple gesture, but if everyone can go outside and experience the climate and feel like they've just expanded their universe for that moment, I think that's an important thing. We also used this modular repetition in terms of the elements of on the building, the eyebrow surrounds, the balconies. And so we developed a pattern-making system that didn't cost that much because we were utilizing them and creating patterns in different ways on different buildings. I mentioned the adaptive reuse. We kept 3 buildings that the Housing Authority did not determine were acceptable for living, and we transformed those into community centers and gyms and administration. So the legacy and the history of the place was still represented. We also developed a very important art collection for the project. I got all my friends who were artists to donate art, and we put art throughout the project, throughout the living areas and the common areas. So this next model or typology is continuing the suburban sort of low-rise, low-development project, but this is a new one that I'm working on right now, and it's in the city of Homestead. And Homestead, as you probably know, is far south and is quite a suburban community, low-rise, low-density. They also have a very strict master plan where everything needs to look like Floribbean architecture. And so we had to do some digging, like what is Floribbean? What does that mean? And the important other aspect of this model is that it was working with a community partner called Touching Miami with Love. They happen to own the property, and we're bringing the developer in. And so we work very closely, and they provide after-school care, adult classes, children's programming. So the intention is that this could be a place where people who now maybe can live and work right next to where their kids are. You can see in this image there's a park on the west side, the Touching Miami with Love facilities on the north, and then we've hidden the parking behind. And then the idea was to create this kind of chevron-shaped building that would maybe appear to break down the massing in this otherwise low-rise, low-density area. And then decoration and elements that were important in the master plan, we interpreted to think about them as more balconies and light filters and ways to create a texture and a decoration that was being sought, but more maybe drawing from the mid-century modern or other contemporary elements. And why am I obsessed with balconies? You'll see in all my projects there's balconies everywhere. And one of the very practical reasons, and you know this, but just to put it into real terms, is that it's a heat mitigator, right? We do not increase the heat coming into the building because not every site allows us the kind of optimal orientation that we would want. So you'll see that has a theme throughout. Another project in which is a different typology, which is an urban infill typology, is in Miami, in Edgewater, one of the most expensive areas in Miami, near the water. So you can see the kind of high-rise, high-density projects that are going up there. Very, very, very little affordable housing. And I'll be honest, some of the challenges of working on this site, because it's a 1/4 acre and it could go up to 36 stories, but with the zoning code, we were limited to 12. So the ground floor, you can see that's the 1/4 acre. We have in Miami, you have to have parking, structured parking. Now, if you're doing 100% affordable, you can reduce that parking by 50%. It still meant that we were required to do 3 stories of parking with stackers inside in order to meet the requirements. A simple envelope with a central core. You'll see the units are repetitious. Another strategy for keeping things affordable is to stack your units. Now, it seems very obvious, but you'd be surprised how often we use transfer slabs in architecture to create interesting cantilevers and elements, but this simple centralized core with 1 bedroom and studio apartments around it, where everyone has an outside balcony to reduce the heat gain. And why do we want to do that? Because we need housing security. If your rent keeps going up, you're not secure in your situation at home. So keeping that in mind, we employ that strategy, as well as creating the opportunity, and I referred to it earlier today, as kind of view equity. We believe that everyone deserves a view, and having a balcony in Miami is quite so. You can see how it's kind of sandwiched in between these taller buildings. We're due to break ground on this in June, so that's been quite a process to get to that point. And then you can see on the ground floor here, the intention is to still reinforce a walkable, interesting ground level, something to attract interest, but also celebrate being outside and drawing from our history of contemporary architecture in South Florida. What's left on the ground floor in these small sites is very little in terms of landscape, but what one can do is still important, and so we like to celebrate using indigenous landscape. This next project is what I call a transit-oriented corridor typology. We are very familiar in Florida with everything as a freeway, and then we've got all these sort of trajectories between the freeways and the ocean edges. And so these corridors are very important as a typology, because why? They're where the transit is going, right? It's up and down where the bus route is. On this particular site, which is a 250 unit house, 250 units, low and very low income tenants, so those earning less than 50% area median income. Follows a similar strategy to the previous one, except it's more efficient. It's nearly an acre in terms of the site. And the intention here was to develop a very slim or skinny floor plate with single loaded corridors, so that we could increase cross ventilation in the units, have surrounded by balconies on the outside, and then have this really beautiful, big, heavy, deep green zone in the middle of it. So the narrower the units, the more the cross ventilation is. And we used the requirement of the code for the parking as a way to develop an upper deck that is for the residents. Let's see. I will show you in the next slide. You'll see the way that this developed a bit further. So this is, again, stacking mostly studios. We were able to, with the code, and I know this is kind of boring for some students, but it's really important, we were able to manipulate the code to get what we want. That's how we work in these environments, and it's critical. So if you're doing mostly affordable, you can get a percentage in the size, reduction in the size of your units, but you still want the unit to be beautiful in a place that you want to live and grow. You can see we modularize most of our interiors with built-in beds, built-in closets, trundle beds, so you have extra storage. And then on the corridor itself, we have mixed use. It's a community grocery store, and that's important because it allows people in the neighborhood to also come and enjoy and be a part of this project. And then you can see how there's a bridge between, so it's all connected. And then in the middle of that is the garden area. And one thing we're not afraid of is we want to develop a strong aesthetic. We want our buildings to be good looking. We want them to be some place that everyone's proud to live in. And we use the kind of natural environment. We play off the shade and the shadows the balcony and the filigree that we're proposing. We also prefabricate all of this in terms of elements. We carefully calibrate the sizes of things so there's the least amount of labor involved. Oops, sorry. Back. So this project we just started working on. This is another typology. In this case, it's mixing income levels, so market and affordable, but it's also working with multiple community groups who have specific programs. And this happens to be just near downtown Miami on the west side of 95, Overtown. And it's considered an important project to connect the community. So our first ideas for this are to really create a presence in that area, sort of an iconic element, but to take the existing conditions. So the orange box is basically an existing community foundation. There's an existing site to the next of it, and we wanted to take that site and transpose it into the center and have everything revolve around the centralized plaza outdoor area. So things like kids programming, there's a school, a kids school, there's an aftercare school, there's different not-for-profit offices, and then also use that element to link to downtown, which you can see in the background here. Given that this is also market rate, we tried to make sure that the elements were also attractive for the entire project, but you don't differentiate between market and affordable. It's all just integrated, and it's just how much you can pay that defines where you would live. Okay, so on the ground floor, again, activating the street edge, providing screens that are for solar protection that are adjustable, so that there's a sliding screen on the facade here, and then allows also to capture the light in a changing and varied way. So sometimes things will be open, sometimes closed, and I think that's important in urban life to create this kind of living edge, living outside. Now I'm going to take you to Los Angeles, where we're doing a very difficult project. I don't know how many of you have been to LA, but I'm sure you know that it's this particular area called Skid Row. It's considered the epicenter of the homelessness crisis. And if you do go there, most people in that area that you will see, most streets are filled with people living on them, and it's a very difficult environment to think about. So this is a project that utilizes technology and innovative construction techniques to try to make it less expensive. And how do we do that? Well, the reality is that we are forging a new system. There's never been a high-rise residential building that is done with this steel frame modular, prefabricated steel frame modular process. And on the top left, you can see the steel frame is very essential, but essentially it's two units that come together that are linked by the corridor, and that equals a module. And let me just go back to that for a second. So what happens is, you can see in the bottom right, this is the actual unit. The unit is prefabricated in the factory about 20 miles from the site. And then it's shipped in all done with all the finishes, the fixtures, everything is done, the cabinets, except for this outer piece, which is kind of like a rain screen facade. And so then these units are erected on site over time, and then the facade is attached after the unit is in place. And there's all what we call mate line connections, which are waterproofing challenges. But that's the concept of this project. You can see here we actually also have used a 3-module type for an open space that is going to be on the 7th floor. We use the same module as a community room, and so we integrate the idea of modularity into the project. In plan, the site is quite difficult. It's a small site, and so it also has a sort of triangulated component. And in order to be efficient and stack and repeatable, the entire tower is the modules. So that usually when you read about some projects that you may be familiar with modular construction, they have a concrete podium in order to transfer down. We've removed that. We have the basement is a concrete podium, but not above ground, so that it's more efficient and faster to install. So this is a view of the envelope. It's a box rib panelized rain screen system and aluminum windows. We also added a series of fins to help mitigate with solar infiltration. And then we have the two module heights per expressed horizontal element to try to bring the scale down and have some horizontal shifts. You can see the 7th floor landing area there. I'll just go back to that up here. This is on the 7th floor, which looks like the 3rd or 4th floor, but that's the 7th floor opening for everyone. And then on the top here are the community rooms, meeting rooms with the great views. And the units, again, are all prefabricated, and we very carefully think how big a piece of plywood is, how a piece of lumber is, and we've calibrated everything to be efficient, again, to bring prices down so that rents can stay low, and everything is built in. So changing direction, something I'm very excited to be working on in the next few years is adaptive reuse. We've always been interested in adaptive reuse, but we're seeing that now you save about 20% of the cost of a project, and it's about 20% faster when you can adapt an existing building to housing. So what makes a good potential project in adaptive reuse? This is actually a project that you may know of, The Doors. I don't know how many of you know of The Doors album. They're a famous rock band from the 70s. Anyway, they made this building very well known because their cover was Morrison Hotel. And, but it's actually stayed empty for 25 years. It's a 1914 structure. And so what happens when something stays empty? The entire community around it is affected. The neighborhood changes. It isn't quite what it needs to be. So bringing housing into these spaces is critical to not just invigorate the building, but also to reinforce the connections, historical connections in the neighborhood. This is an E-shaped existing plan. So why one building versus another? This happened to have what they called SRO, single resident occupancy. But one of the challenges that our clients have found is that when you have shared bathrooms, they have a lot of challenges with the tenants and the residents just have a hard time with it. So in this building as well, which is called Angel Tower, let me just repeat something here. So you'll see this is a repetitive module. We're enlarging the bathroom so that everyone has their own bathroom. But the good thing is that it has plumbing because it was at some point a hotel. So when you choose adapting buildings to housing, you have to think about, in terms of costs and infrastructure, what you have to work with. And so this type of a building is well suited. It also happens to be a 4-story building, and so in that way, you don't have to put in high-rise fire requirements and all sorts of extra utility spaces that become challenging. So these are just existing buildings. You see no sort of architectural hand on the outside. They're beautifully designed. This was Curlett and Beelman in 1924. It's called the Insurance Exchange Building. But this building is a little harder because it was a commercial building. And so commercial buildings inherently don't have an easy to convert either footprint or infrastructure. And so it's a lot more expensive, takes a lot longer to do. But it had a rational floor plan for that. So there was merit to the client's choice to buy the building, to turn it into affordable housing based on its layout. But in Los Angeles, as you probably all know, there's seismic issues and there's a lot of challenge for structure. So there's a lot of infrastructure improvement that has to happen in a building like this. It's 12 stories, but we were able to do 248 units and are just finishing construction documents on this. I want to change a little bit of tack now and talk about the culture as a public realm and why this is important. In fact, most of our early projects work more on the culture side than on the housing side, and I started to realize that housing in itself was a part of the public realm, not necessarily a separate program, that everyone had the right to that experience. One of my very first projects in South Florida was what is Young Circle Arts Park project, and I was actually hired to design a wedding gazebo and spent some time and thought, I don't think a wedding gazebo is going to do a whole lot for this space downtown. It was, at the time, the existing Hollywood Arts Park people had a difficult time getting to it, crossing the street. There was a lot of challenging elements to it. Anyway, rolling forward, several years later, maybe 7 years, and this project took me 11 years to do. So you have to have stamina when you're doing these kinds of projects. But what we did was we came back and said, you know, you shouldn't do a gazebo. What you should do is this arts programming. There's an amazing project right on the southeast corner called the Art and Culture Center that was a very vibrant arts organization. There were hundreds of artists associated with it, and we realized that this was a gem. And so we came up with a project that really celebrated how the arts can transform an urban environment. And this is the center and the heart of Hollywood. And so it's finally, over the years now, becoming a kind of a space and place where people are celebrating art and culture. We invented programs such as glass blowing studio, metal studio, painting workshops, a dance studio, rehearsal studio for an amphitheater that we also designed. But most importantly, we also celebrated the existing landscape on the site and created these sort of outdoor reading rooms, places to have lunch, go from downtown, go for a walk, take a break at the end of the day. And the architecture is very expressive. It expresses the fact that there's no front or back. It's just in the round. You literally have to, it's quite hard, by the way, to figure out how to serve spaces where you can't see the back. And it also took a long time because it was in multiple phases. But one of the important things was to recognize the heritage of this place, working with the original young circle shapes and places, and also an historic neighborhood. Professor Rifkin referred to this project. This is the Girls Club Foundation. And this is the existing building before we got our hands on it. And why is it important? It just happened to be a little invisible building just north of City Hall. And this is in a district called the Flagler Village District in downtown Fort Lauderdale. And this is behind the main parking lot of City Hall, and really unnoticed for the most part. So the client is an artist, and she is a collector also of women's art and works very hard to promote women artists. Her work is very textural and uses collage and video. And so we were keen to represent her in a way as we communicated why this is so important in our culture. One of my first sketches, in some ways, was just to erase things, like just to, in a way, remove things. I also had a very challenging program. We weren't allowed to expand the site, so we could only really remove in order to add, which is an interesting concept, right? Mostly we want to add and make more of something. So we extracted existing overhangs and we removed stuff, and we also wanted to create this kind of idea that when you come in, it's a surprise, and dealing with light. So these are two sections that show it was originally storage for boats and things, and so we basically gutted the whole interior and then revealed the existing structure, and then added a floating mezzanine as well as a kind of program for admin and storage. One of my favorite parts of architecture is under construction. It's just when you really start to see the essence of your project, your buildings come to life, and as they evolve, and things that maybe are surprising, and maybe things that you're happy about, and maybe things that you're not so happy about, but at least it's a place to really start to read and create and understand the legibility of the process. We used, in the local, I was interested in trying to find a local industry that would allow us to find a material, so we used this polymer type resin to create this new facade, which you see here, which essentially is 4x6 panels with a steel frame structure behind. And then I couldn't add any trees. I wanted to have a surface that in a way captured the trees and the light and the temporal change on its surface. And that's what this facade did. And in the center of it was a kind of harkens back to our client's use of steel and materials, and of course influenced by Mr. Sarah, who we lost recently. But this is a patina. This is a paint patina. We didn't have enough money to use Corten steel, so we found this paint that will actually oxidize the steel, and it creates that patina that you see in some of these amazing artworks of Sarah. And then at night, the intention was to create a beacon, literally, so people could find us and see where it was, and that it spoke to something intriguing behind the walls of it. And also revealed its own structure. And then at times that we would turn the lights off and it would be a projection surface. So then inside, you can start to see the kind of elements are quite fun. The codifying with color is where that is. There's a little exhibition space at the back there that was actually our kitchen. If you know Greta Schott-Lahosky's Frankfurt kitchen, this was my ode to her and the sort of idea that we need to show domesticity in women's work and women's lives in a different way, and that was kind of a play on that. And then we had these rotating walls that allow the gallery to be experienced differently. Sometimes they do performances, sometimes it's arts, sometimes it's video. So we had a changing idea and that how culture is changing. And then you'll see we left the existing windows where they were and created a translucent scrim on the inside as well to bring in light and to play with light. The next project is Young at Art. It's a children's art museum, and it's a library. And this is another kind of project, right, where you have a collaboration of different entities. Another project that took 10 years to do, by the way, which seems like a long time, but now I'm like, okay, we got it done. Anyway, the site was a terrible site. It was filled with muck. No one wanted it, so they gave it to us, to the museum to have, because no one really else would work on it. So our interest there happened to be located right on I-95, which is a major east-west route, so high visibility. So we took advantage of that and aligned the layout along I-95, but importantly created essentially a warehouse for exhibition programming that could change, that could navigate through, and these green lines and green spaces are kind of creating this internal landscape element that in a way was the guide to a very complex program. I mentioned that I love construction, but why is this important? You right now are doing your own concrete wall, which is really going to be beautiful, and this was a tilt-up version of that. And we had to spend a lot of time understanding how the light would be reflected off that surface, which is a chevron type surface, and how it would amplify, and then different openings on the north, south, east, and west. So I think there's lessons to be learned just in the making of architecture that one can constantly celebrate. This is the main entrance of that building on the south side. It's actually an art institute as well as exhibition spaces. And one of the great things about it is that kids really seem to love the building, which is really cool. And then they start to think of orange as a color that means it talks about architecture. So they ended up doing orange T-shirts, and it just became a whole sort of way of thinking about language. One of the important things in a big warehouse is how to carve out space and how do you bring natural light in. And this was an area where the kids could eat outside and still be safe and surrounded by views into the courtyard, as well as create natural flues for cross-ventilation. And on this is facing the highway, there was a large retention area, and this was an important element visually. We also, this was in 2010, and we started work in 2007. We actually brought in cisterns. We exposed all the inside of the utilities so that there was a legibility to learning in that environment. So here you can see inside, and I think very similar to your building here, there's kind of an understanding of that there's a system behind this building that works and is exposed, and opportunities for learning. Of course, who is our client, right? So I think it seems obvious, but it's really important to constantly remind yourself. So this meant creating spaces that people feel comfortable in to take risks, whether it's painting or making something. This was another part of the project that was really important, of course, having polished concrete floors and things that are easy to clean, and the maintenance side of things as well. The last few projects, this is one that I've been working on also for about 8 years now. It's up at the Boca Raton Museum of Art. And I show this to you not because it's necessarily my favorite project, but how do you do something with very little? So this is a very large existing building in downtown Boca Raton, which is a Meisner-esque language of representation. And so we had to deal with the fact that there's a very prescribed way of working and expressing oneself. But our charge was to fix the loading dock gate, create a new entrance from the back to make it look like the front, and then activate the outside of the building. Not easy, right? Because those things are all very ephemeral. There's either a fence element or a landscape element. So I worked with Roberto Rivera, a colleague, landscape architect from FIU, and he did an amazing job. And then I was also commissioned to do an art element, which is called Mending Wall, which became the new fence, essentially, for the project. And you can see we gutted the inside of the building on the corner to create a kind of new gallery space, and we created this beautiful lit, essentially loading dock gate that is now an art element. At the time, it was named Mending Wall after Robert Frost because there was a lot of issues with fencing going on. So I won't go into that, but there's a lot more to that. This is on Federal Highway. One of the biggest challenges was that people were driving by between 30 and 50 miles an hour and not really seeing the museum. It's a giant building and no one knew where it was. So bringing the programming from the inside to the outside, sculpture, landscape, benches, we turned that into a kind of outdoor display area. And in the courtyard, we made sure that the art that was brought in, this is Mark Menon, was actually functional art so that people could interact with it and spend time, and all this for free. You know, you don't have to go inside the museum. It became very important as well. So the last project I'm going to share with you is a project it took me, so I feel like there's a story here, 11 years to do this one. It's a public art commission for the city of Tamarack, and so the city of Tamarack is here to the right-hand side, and this is the Everglades. You may know this is I-75 that essentially bifurcates the city from the Everglades. And the art commission was to design something that people could look at the Everglades with. And so I went to the site and I discovered that there's this big mound on the site, which actually turned out had garbage in it, and it was just being covered in grass. And I thought, well, you know, how do you see over? And the Everglades, well, the Everglades we all know is just horizontal, flat. You can't really, when you look at the Everglades, it's just a line, right? So the idea of elevating in Florida, to me, is very interesting, how a topography shift, right? So there may not be this kind of literal view of the Everglades. And by the way, we just photographed this last week. This just got finished. So now, by elevating people, they start to feel like they're on a hammock. They start to feel like they're in this disrupted horizontal plane. And then looking towards the Everglades may not be that you see the sunset, because most of the park doesn't even stay open for long enough to see the sunset. But it's a place that you can be saturated by this rich color of red, and the sense that this is a space that has some curiosity to it. And I also wanted it to be visible from this infrastructure. I wanted to have a conversation about how infrastructure and our precarious relationship to this incredible body of water and landscape is kind of needs to be addressed. So this is an occupiable sculpture. At the very end, this large boxy element is actually what I call a community periscope. We have polished chrome inside, and it actually reflects what's beyond it back into this kind of surface. So that's what I have to share with you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I'm happy to open the floor to questions, but I wanted to first ask you, just talk a little bit about the importance of color in your work.
I love it. Well, for me, there's different ways I use color. I mean, there's an obvious wayfinding. There's a wayfinding system in most of our projects. Like at Kennedy Homes, we learned after listening to a lot of oral history from the neighbors that fruit was, they used to have fruit trees outside their front doors. And so we thought that they are both showing the colors of yellow and orange and sort of talking about the fruit, the brightness, kind of was a way to connect to something beyond the architecture. And then we also did a series of graphic signage elements that showed giant oranges and giant fruit. And that's an element, bit of color and as well. And then for me, color is also difficult in this Florida sun. And so creating saturated colors has to be very purposeful and specific when you do use them, because you either have to spend a lot of money to get it, or you have to really kind of figure out what color it's going to be in 10 years' time. So I was very interested in the arts park. In fact, this is a funny color story. I had orange. I felt that the orange was a very strong color there because it kind of reminded people this is something different. But the mayor was absolutely in shock when they opened the park and there was orange fencing because she said it was like Home Depot color. So, you know, orange is politicized. Colors can be politicized. And so they painted it gray. So they removed the color and it changed the way that the space felt, you know. And so I feel like color is great in just enlivening a space, but also can send us another subliminal message or conversation about value. And this one, the Sunset Hammock project, it just meant that everyone could have a sunset whenever they went there. So that's how I kind of thought of the color there.
Cool. Questions?
Great work, really, really fascinating. And in particular, I really enjoy the housing and your commitment to that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if, a little bit about the background in terms of the development of, do you have now 2 offices? Is there one based out of Los Angeles?
Well, we did, and then with COVID, we ended up pulling back and focusing more on virtual. So, but now we're about to go into construction. So we have an office physically, but we have people now who are dispersed. So there's discussions about whether that needs to be reinstituted as a physical space, you know, with people actually in the office, or whether it'll be more of a place where we come in for a few weeks at a time, or we have a couple of people in LA who might do some of the CA, and they might just use it as a satellite office, so they might be there a couple of days a week. So it's quite a fluid thing, but for the owners who were out there initially, they liked the idea that we were present because we were going to be in their space around the corner all the time. But there also happen to be national clients, and so they've now, after COVID, everyone's shifted and feels like it's actually okay to have someone fly in or just be on a virtual meeting.
So I'm interested in the fact that you have those 2 locales is so dominant in the work and stuff. Within the American landscape, I guess those kind of, there are a lot of similarities between them. Yeah, maybe not exactly, obviously not exactly the same. I wonder if through all this work, in a decade or more, that you have some reflection on similarities and differences between the 2 landscapes.
So I also, I mean, I'm a Baudrillard fan, so I get the whole sort of idea of kind of coming as a foreigner to America. But I went to SCI-Arc, so I did get to know Los Angeles very well. I lived there for like 10 years. And so for me, the ability to invent with sort of different types of materials is very much an expression in LA's architecture. Whereas in Florida, we are rooted much more in a kind of, in the manufacture of concrete and prefabricated windows that are all the same type. Just the vernacular of Florida is quite, different from LA in that way. And in fact, when using a lighter system comes, for that large, tall building, the 15-story building, steel frame, what actually allowed us to be a little freer with our windows systems and things that in Florida we couldn't do, we couldn't afford to do. The other thing is a rain screen system makes a lot of sense in the climate in California, which dries out quicker, so you don't have, that's an easier one than here where there's a lot more parameters to consider. So I think there's definitely some materials. The light to me, Diebenkorn captures the light. If only the buildings could be like that. But the light in California, it seems a softer, less severe, less shadow casting light. So I feel that we think about that in the projects. But everything's changing now. This winter has been very wet in Los Angeles. And so we might be the best equipped to design in LA now. But I think that it definitely does inform the materials. Using corrugated metal in LA is very common. Here it's not. We worry about rusting and all of the rest of that. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I guess further, since I do detect the accent, but I don't know specifically where from, and or what age you've now, how long you've lived in the States, but if that provides further reflection in terms of your where you maybe grew up, in terms of experience of versus these very very peculiar landscapes for maybe much of the world. Both very car dependent for one.
Yes, yes. So I'm from South Africa. I was born in Zimbabwe and grew up in South Africa, from Durban, which is a coastal town, big port on the east coast of southern Africa, and went to undergraduate there and was schooled in this kind of idea that you'd fail the project if you hadn't oriented your building correctly, right? There was this very strict idea of how to relate your building to the environment. And so that was both on the aesthetic side, where it was about making sure that the natural environment was part of your building, on the protection of the building. But I think also more so, we don't depend on air conditioning there. We don't, it's too expensive. So most people need to have cross ventilation, need to have shallower rooms in typical housing projects. And the poverty is so high that I think it's just always permeated my understanding of my role in society must be to try to help people have better quality of life in their home environment. So I think that's rooted in my origins and my passion for now doing it here as well.
You find a lot of support down in Los Angeles, the mayor,
Yeah. The thing about LA is a one-bedroom unit to build costs about $1 million. So when you start at this, right, now you've got to think a developer or whoever's doing it has to get it rented. Well, the project, that 15-story building we're doing, that one story is going to be $500 to $800. Something equivalent is going to be about $3,000 to $4,000 in the regular market. So finding ways to bring costs of construction down is very hard because materials cost, we all know the reasons for that. But that's an imperative, right? Because you just cannot, people are going to be living without a house pretty quickly in that environment. I think it's 65,000 unhoused people in Los Angeles County. Yeah. Yes.
I was kind of actually curious because I'm not really sure how affordable housing is maintained or I guess restricted in terms of the pricing.
Sure.
And so I was wondering how does that play into the design of the apartments, because generally speaking, I feel like a lot of apartments we see now honestly don't look nearly half as interesting or as beautiful as the ones that you showed, and I feel like as a building that is very well designed and it's attractive in comparison to others that are honestly market price but local versus how does that
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. Those are good questions because it's not really mysterious how you have to bring prices down because, so let me start back up a bit. Do you know what AMI or area median income is? So the way that the industry, the affordable housing industry works is they've categorized, and I have some problems with that, different income levels, and they've said, okay, if you're going to do a low-income housing tax credit funded project from the state of Florida, you have to have maybe 20% of people earning, say 80% or less than the area median income. So the area median income takes the incomes and figures out what the median is for a family, not for an individual. So let's just say right now it's about 80,000 in Broward County. So they take that and say you shouldn't pay more than 30% of your salary towards that. So if you're earning 50% or less than the area median income, means a family is earning less than or equal to $40,000 as a family. Those are the people my projects are primarily for, people earning less than 50% of the area median income. Very few projects are for that level of income. Most are for 80, or even this new law that many of you may have heard of called the Live Local law is called it's addressing the missing middle, which is more workforce housing, up to 140% of the area median income. So that's how the regulatory environment looks at how do you regulate it. Now different developers and different entities will deal with that differently. So it basically means if there's 10 units and they're all exactly the same, and you earn $100 and this person earns $80, your rent will be different in your monthly rent. The apartment doesn't change, your access to services, supportive services, all those things remain the same. So there's always this kind of balance that the people doing the housing try to figure out between how many where they're not going to make enough money versus how many where they can make more money, which is why the project in Overtown is interesting, because they really are going to have to use the market rate funding to support some of the more affordable units. And I think also it doesn't isolate income levels, right, where you end up with projects where people have different income level, though no one really knows. I mean, at Kennedy Homes, we had 500 people on a wait list the day it opened, and it's never been less than 500 in over a decade. And you can't really, most people when they drive by don't think of it as affordable. I don't know, did that help explain that?
Yeah, like I understand like how like the system works now, and like how I guess like people like for different products like wages like end up like living there. But I was just wondering like
The look and feel, how do we make certain decisions about
making
it look better? Well, you're all going to be able to do that. I mean, it's really about prioritizing, and I've alluded to this a couple times, but stacking units sounds so boring. But as soon as you don't do that, you're going to spend more money. So that's one element of a plethora of elements that we look at. We, in the Little River Plaza with the big crenulated facade, that one, every project that you look at in Miami has a transfer deck at the podium. We don't. So every structural column goes all the way through from the ground to the top to 12 stories. That saved us probably $4 million. We only have balconies just enough to be able to cantilever them, so we don't have to add structure at the end of it. We have micro units. Clearly, you know, materials is money. So the more materials you have, the more expensive it is, but you don't necessarily get that much more rent, because the most expensive part of your buildings are your kitchens and bathrooms. So we have figured out what that ratio is. And then we beg, plead, and threaten our clients to make sure that they look good. In many cases, they now want to do that as well. But you have to develop tools to still have some money, because obviously you can remove balconies, right? It doesn't, you can take away balconies. It's not required from a purely living standard, but we know housing security, and we work with people. We work with clients who have a mission that we also believe in. I find that to be, and I should have said that at the beginning, you can't choose every job that you want, but you can start to choose which you don't want, right? I mean, we've not taken certain projects because we didn't think we could make a contribution that was important. So I don't know that I gave you an easy answer, but it is iterative, it's minute sometimes, and it's also big decisions.
Has also to do with the type of housing that our students have access to. Is that kind of where that's coming from, too? Because you're seeing a beautiful project, right?
Yeah.
These are beautiful units.
It seems like
and they look nothing like the luxury student housing that you all pay a ton of money for.
Exactly.
And I think what's really interesting about housing here in this town is that it's incredibly expensive. All of our students are paying a lot of money to live very close to the university. And it's very poorly constructed. It is not half as nice as the projects you're showing. And they are paying an extraordinary market rate. But I also believe that in the development of those projects, for students, it counts as affordable housing, because students technically don't have the income. The income is, the money to pay for it is coming from their families. So there are the incentives that the developers are getting to build these things, but they're not providing the quality to the occupants that our occupants are seeing in these things. You know, I talk to my students and they come in and like, I'm sorry, my shower door fell on me today. You know, that happens at the standard all the time. My husband also teaches. That's happened to his, like those things happen to our students. They move into these things that have, you know, $1,000 a month for a room, and they're having these sort of catastrophes happen to them, and they're not even getting a nice quality of space. So I think maybe some of the questions are coming from
That's helpful.
from that for you to understand. It's like, oh,
Right.
please come to Gainesville.
Yeah.
Please come. Please bring your extraordinary
I
work
think
here.
Thank you for that elaboration, because it makes me realize one of the tools that we've used to reduce overall costs actually is maybe not so popular, and that's reducing amenities. So if in most, I've read about some student housing. I don't know what yours is like, but in many cases there's a lot of amenity spaces. There's no rent income for amenity spaces. That gets prorated into your actual apartment, right? So in our projects, there's a goal to reduce those to the essential, but then also create community connections. So if you have to have supportive services, help the local group that might help with you be located in the bottom of the building or nearby, or support. So there's a broader way of thinking about programming that doesn't rely completely on what's in the building itself, which also means site selection becomes critical, right? Where you locate, because if you're out somewhere and there's no one who's going to help service you, now you need to get more amenity, and therefore your costs are going to be different, and maybe you're now missing middle or 140% and up. So I think that it's like a whole way of viewing it that has to be considered. But anything that I'm doing, you guys can do. That's the thing, because you also are more tuned into this. Literally a decade ago, I would go to a community meeting, and everyone thought I was just making things up. No one needs this. It's not that important, And so I think today the conversation around housing is actually to our advantage. We get to actually say, yes, I know someone, not just a not in my backyard approach to everything. So I'm very enthusiastic about the future with everyone.
Have you also run into difficulty with authorities, either design review boards or clients, in terms of the question of how to break up the massing? Because we hear that as the typical excuse for why so many contemporary office or apartment buildings have 7 to 12 different materials spread on them, like a kind of facade sampler plate. And you don't. You do.
Yeah,
you make do with 2 materials.
Yeah, it's a thing. But where
It's
do
a
I go
bad
with
thing.
this? There's a lot of aspects to that to break down. Like, some codes are really prescriptive, right? There's a zoning code overlay in many districts that is so prescriptive, and you just have to be incredibly skillful and resilient about insisting that you're going to spend more money the more materials you have, right? So if I've got to go in, if you have your property management is going to go up. I try to make really rational arguments when I'm out there so that I can do what I need to do here, right? So that way, when you're presenting to the community, you say, we had to do a design review board presentation recently in the city of Miami. Fortunately, there were some great architects on that, and they loved Little River Plaza, which is the crenulated one. But on other occasions, we had a project in downtown Fort Lauderdale that used a brise soleil. It was beautiful. I wanted to live there. Everyone wants to live there. And the city would not approve it. What happened, though, they did say they would approve it, and then the neighborhood came out, and they said, and it didn't have to do with aesthetics. That's the irony. It didn't have to do with aesthetics. It had to do with the fact that people were going to be earning less money than them. And so they used all these different tropes to say no and got the city to say no. But in the end, I do think that if you're logical and rational about your arguments for minimizing materials, more massing shifts is more money, is cantilevers and transfers and all those things. So we try to imagine buildings that if everything was value engineered, it would still look good, right? So that if you took it down to its least number of elements, would it stand up, right, to the look and feel that you want it to have? So I think that would be, I mean, we did that with Kennedy Homes. We did Kennedy Homes at $92 a square foot, and that's with 11 different buildings and lots of park areas and lots of open space and community spaces. The going rate at that time was about 150 to 175. And so we did that with Young at Art Museum. We gave back $800,000 to the client at the end of that project.
Wow.
Out of the budget, but it was, using tilt-up, using systems that, but then we shaped the tilt-up, right? We spent a bit more money on the shape of the building, because we didn't want it to just, we felt it wasn't going to contribute, wasn't going to be dynamic, wasn't going to support interest in children's futures. So I think there's always a balance, and we do lose battles, though. We lose battles. I wouldn't say that we're always successful.
I really love so many things that you're talking about, but one that, you know, the way that you source some local materials, including like locally fabricated, like how much does that come into play, like locally, like materials and also the labor as both the cost-saving measure and as, you know, as well as an environmental measure.
Sure.
And how do you do that too?
Some of the strategies have included, for example, there's a lot of people who can build with masonry. I mean, it's not sustainable, we think, in the future, but that's been like in Kennedy Homes. We needed to use a material that the labor would be readily available locally, and also that to your point about buildings not being built well, right? We needed to make sure that we didn't take risk in those environments. You can't have water penetrating the building, moisture, and all those things. So using those local crafts is really critical to just long-term sustainability. I struggle a little bit with, I want to have different materials in our projects, and it's difficult because the risk is that it doesn't get built properly, and then you have a problem, right, with the building. So we struggle a little bit. We're trying to find new ways of building, which is why we did the modular. But interestingly, the modular is cost neutral for the actual bulk of the building. What saves money is the time it takes for the building to be built. And that goes from, say, 28 months down to 18, 19 months. Now that's a huge amount of money. It doesn't come out of a pot, but it's interest, it's insurance, it's all of those things. So we haven't really, I've been looking into cross-laminated timber for a long time and other things, and every time we did a design for an addition to a museum out of CLT, and still discovered it wasn't as sustainable as we thought it was going to be. So, I mean, I still think that I have to still try more out there. I haven't really solved it. The panels that we made for the Girls Club, which were those 4x6 panels, which the boat building industry, right? All boats are made out of this kind of fiberglass, not necessarily the environmentally friendly one, but so we found a local boat builder. We went out, we actually first looked in California and everywhere, and we were like, this doesn't make any sense. We found someone, they poured them on site. We had to do the approvals to get them, you know, the notice of acceptances and everything. But so that's a way that we did that. And that moment was, it's a smaller building, more precise. We could do that then. But I'm still figuring this out. Sure.
I really interested in the Skid Row project you were talking about, because I understand it's like a huge crisis right now
Yes.
in the California area, and it makes me wonder more about like the clients you have and how you're saying you can't always choose what you do, but like how do they find you, or who found you there?
Sure.
More about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the short answer is that particular group is a healthcare company. It's AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and they're not-for-profit, and they have clinics and places all over the world. So what they do is they take their money from their healthcare industry, and they've decided that their patients can never really be healthy unless they have a home. And so they've transferred that from one source to another output there. So they found us, and by the way, all their projects are for everyone. You don't have to have AIDS or HIV or anything to be living there. That happens to be their business. And they're an activist organization. They kind of come from a very difficult background where they had to, for 30 years, try to, you know, promote healthcare in that environment. And so they're on a mission, and they found me on the internet. I don't know, they Googled affordable housing. They happened to have a Southern Bureau headquarters in Fort Lauderdale. And so, you know, they just sort of found me, then they interviewed me, which was petrifying, because I thought, oh my God, you know, we'll never make this. And then we had a 20-minute interview, then we had an hour, turned into a 4-hour session, a working session. And now we've done about 10 buildings with them. So, yeah. Make sure your website's up to date, which I'm bad at. Yeah. No, I think that it's not, I mean, to be more serious about that, your work speaks for itself as well. You have to, I mean, we don't do single family homes that much. I mean, we just don't. And so if someone's looking for a really great single family home architect, they're not going to come to us. It's just because what we do is something else. And so that's part of why I say to you from my very opening statement is, once you start doing what you like and what you want, and you see that, you know, this is going to lead you to other things that are not so divergent from it.
Well, thank you so much, Margi. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. This was great. Cool. All right. Well, thank you all. And as a reminder, Monday evening at 6:15, we have our next and final lecture for the semester. Daniel Barber will be here in FAB 105. So see you then. Thank you.